In the history of the American Mafia, certain names inspire fear even decades after their deaths. Aniello Dellacroce was one of those names. Known as Neil to friends and Mr. Neil to those who feared him, Dellacroce was the underboss of the Gambino crime family during its most powerful era. He was a stone-cold killer with dead eyes that earned him the nickname Father O'Neill because they looked like polished stones in a statue. This is the story of a man who represented the old mafia values of honor, loyalty, and ruthless violence, and whose death would change the course of organized crime history forever. Aniello John Dellacroce was born on March 15, 1914, in New York City to Italian immigrant parents. His name in Italian, Dellacroce, means "of the cross," and some would say he bore that cross through a life of violence and crime. Growing up in the Little Italy section of Manhattan, young Aniello was surrounded by the world of La Cosa Nostra from his earliest days. The New York of Dellacroce's youth was a city divided into territories controlled by 5 powerful mafia families: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno. These families controlled everything from the docks to the garment district, from gambling operations to labor unions. For a young Italian boy with ambition and no fear of violence, the mafia offered a path to respect and wealth that legitimate society denied. By his late teens, Dellacroce had already earned a reputation as a vicious street fighter and an enforcer. He stood over 6 feet tall, which was unusual for Italian Americans of that generation, earning him the nickname the Tall Guy. But it wasn't just his height that made him intimidating, it was his eyes. Cold, lifeless, shark-like eyes that seemed to look through you. When Aniello Dellacroce stared at you, you knew you were in the presence of a born killer. In the 1930s, Dellacroce became associated with the Mangano crime family, which would later become the Gambino family. He quickly proved himself as someone willing to do the dirty work that made the mafia function. Collections, beatings, murders, Dellacroce handled it all with ruthless efficiency. His reputation grew throughout the New York underworld as a man you absolutely did not cross. His big break came when he caught the attention of Albert Anastasia, one of the most feared mobsters in American history. Anastasia, known as the Lord High Executioner, was the boss of what would become the Gambino family and the founder of Murder Incorporated, a group of contract killers who carried out hits for the mafia. Anastasia recognized in Dellacroce a kindred spirit, someone who understood that violence wasn't just a tool, but an art form. Under Anastasia's mentorship, Dellacroce rose rapidly through the ranks. He became a captain, controlling rackets in Manhattan and the Bronx. He oversaw gambling operations, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and hijacking. But his real value was as an enforcer. When someone needed to be taught a lesson or permanently removed, Dellacroce was the man Anastasia trusted to get it done. In 1957, everything changed. Albert Anastasia was murdered in the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, shot to death while getting a shave. It was one of the most famous mob hits in history, and it created a power vacuum in the family. Carlo Gambino, through cunning and political maneuvering, took control of the family and renamed it after himself. Dellacroce could have opposed this. He was loyal to Anastasia and had the muscle to challenge Gambino. But Dellacroce was also smart. He recognized that Carlo Gambino was a brilliant strategist who would make the family even more powerful. Instead of starting a war, Dellacroce pledged his loyalty to the new boss. In return, Gambino made him a captain and eventually promoted him to Underboss, the second most powerful position in the family. This partnership between Gambino and Dellacroce would last for decades and turn the Gambino family into the most powerful criminal organization in America. They complemented each other perfectly. Gambino was the diplomat, the thinker, the man who made alliances and worked behind the scenes. Dellacroce was the enforcer, the feared street boss who commanded absolute loyalty through respect and terror. As underboss, Dellacroce controlled the family's operations in Manhattan and the Bronx. He oversaw hundreds of soldiers and associates who ran everything from gambling rings to labor rackets. The money flowing through his hands was astronomical. But what Dellacroce valued more than money was respect. He was old school. He believed in the traditions, the code, the way things had always been done. His base of operations was the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy. This wasn't just a social club. It was the seat of power for the Gambino family's Manhattan operations. Every day, wise guys would line up outside the Ravenite to pay their respects to Mr. Neal. They would kiss his hand, report their earnings, seek his counsel, and await his orders. To be summoned to see Dellacroce was either a great honor or a death sentence, depending on why he wanted to see you. The stories about Dellacroce's brutality are legendary. He once allegedly bit off a man's ear during a dispute. He was suspected in dozens of murders, though he was too smart to ever get caught. His crew was known as one of the most violent in New York, filled with stone-cold killers who would do anything for Mr. Neal. The police had thick files on Dellacroce, but building a case against him was nearly impossible. Witnesses refused to testify. Evidence disappeared. The code of omertà protected him. But Dellacroce wasn't just a thug. He was intelligent, well-read, and sophisticated. He understood psychology and used it to manipulate people. He could be charming when it served his purposes, switching from friendly conversation to ice-cold menace in an instant. This unpredictability made him even more terrifying. You never knew which Dellacroce you were going to get. His relationship with Carlo Gambino was one of mutual respect. Gambino trusted Dellacroce to handle the violent side of the business while he focused on expanding the family, his legitimate businesses, and political connections. When Gambino died of natural causes in 1976, everyone expected Dellacroce to become the new boss. He was the underboss. He had earned it. He deserved it. But Gambino had other plans. In his will, Gambino named his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, as the new boss of the family. This decision stunned the mafia world. Castellano was a businessman, not a street guy. He wore suits and preferred boardrooms to back alleys. He was everything Dellacroce and the old-school gangsters weren't. This should have started a war. Dellacroce had the loyalty of the family's most violent crews. If he had wanted to challenge Castellano, he could have. But once again, Dellacroce chose loyalty over ambition. He accepted Castellano as boss, and in return, Castellano kept him as underboss and gave him complete control over the family's Manhattan operations. But the peace was uneasy. Castellano and Dellacroce represented two different visions of what the mafia should be. Castellano wanted to move away from street crime and focus on white-collar rackets, construction, and legitimate businesses. Dellacroce represented the old ways, the blood and violence that had built the mafia. Their crews barely spoke to each other. The family was essentially split in two, with Castellano's white-collar faction and Dellacroce's street faction operating almost independently. Into this tension stepped a young, ambitious captain named John Gotti. Gotti was part of Dellacroce's crew, and he saw Dellacroce as a mentor and father figure. Gotti was everything Dellacroce valued: tough, loyal, a big earner, and willing to kill when necessary. Dellacroce protected Gotti and other young captains who chafed under Castellano's leadership. The problem was that Castellano had banned drug dealing, which was hypocritical since the family made millions from drugs. But Castellano wanted to distance himself from that part of the business. Meanwhile, Gotti and others in Dellacroce's crew were making fortunes from heroin and cocaine. Castellano knew about it and wanted to move against them, but he couldn't because Dellacroce protected them. The only thing preventing a civil war in the Gambino family was Dellacroce's presence. Both sides respected him too much to start fighting while he was alive. He was the glue holding the family together, the bridge between the old generation and the new, between the street crews and the white-collar faction. By the early 1980s, Dellacroce's health began failing. He had lived a hard life, and decades of stress, violence, and excess were taking their toll. He developed cancer, and his once powerful frame began to waste away. But even dying, Dellacroce commanded absolute respect. Wise guys who saw him in his final days said his eyes still had that same cold intensity that had terrified people for 50 years. On December 2, 1985, Aniello Dellacroce died of lung cancer at the age of 71. He died at his home in Staten Island, surrounded by family and close associates. His death marked the end of an era. He was one of the last of the old-school mob bosses, a man who had started in the streets during Prohibition and lived to see the Mafia's golden age. But his death had immediate and catastrophic consequences. Just 2 weeks later, on December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano was murdered outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. John Gotti had orchestrated the hit, and without Dellacroce's restraining influence, the younger generation seized power. Gotti became boss, and the Gambino family entered a new, more violent, and ultimately more destructive phase. Many believe that if Dellacroce had lived longer, the Castellano murder never would have happened. Gotti wouldn't have dared move against the boss while Mr. Neal was alive. Dellacroce's loyalty to the hierarchy, despite his personal disagreements with Castellano, was absolute. His death removed the one obstacle preventing a power struggle that would eventually lead to the family's downfall. Dellacroce never served significant prison time, which is remarkable given his decades of criminal activity. He was arrested multiple times but always beat the charges through intimidated witnesses, disappeared evidence, and skilled lawyers. He was one of the most successful gangsters in American history at avoiding prosecution, a testament to his intelligence and the fear he inspired. His legacy in the mafia world is complicated. To the old-timers, Dellacroce represented everything the mafia should be: loyalty, honor, strength, and the willingness to use violence when necessary. To law enforcement, he was a sociopathic killer who terrorized New York for half a century. To John Gotti and the younger generation, he was a beloved mentor whose death left a void that could never be filled. The Ravenite Social Club, Dellacroce's headquarters, would later become famous as John Gotti's base of operations, but it was Dellacroce who had made it a seat of power, who had turned a simple storefront into one of the most feared addresses in New York. Today, the Ravenite is closed, a relic of a bygone era when the Mafia ruled Little Italy. Dellacroce's family life was complicated. He had a wife and children, but he also had a longtime mistress and an illegitimate family. In the Mafia world, this was accepted. Mobsters often had mistresses, and Dellacroce was no exception. His children, both legitimate and illegitimate, would remain connected to the life, with some following in his footsteps into organized crime. Stories about Dellacroce are still told in mob circles today. His reputation for violence was so extreme that FBI agents who investigated him admitted they were relieved when he died of natural causes rather than in a mob war. They feared what would happen if the restraints came off and Dellacroce decided to go to war. The body count, they believed, would have been staggering. In the end, Aniello Dellacroce was a paradox. A brutal killer who inspired loyalty and even love in his followers. A man who believed in honor while participating in the most dishonorable acts. A traditionalist in a world that was rapidly changing. He lived by the code and died having never broken it, which in the mafia world is the highest achievement. His death marked a turning point. The old ways he represented would soon be replaced by the flashy, reckless style of John Gotti. The code of silence he had upheld would be broken by Sammy Gravano. The family he had helped build would be devastated by RICO prosecutions. Everything Dellacroce stood for would crumble within a decade of his death. But for those who knew him, Mr. Neal remains a legend. The tall guy, the man with the dead eyes, the underboss who could have been boss but chose loyalty instead, the killer who commanded such respect that his mere presence could prevent a war, the last of the old-school mobsters who remembered when the Mafia actually meant something. Aniello Dellacroce died on December 2, 1985, at age 71 from lung cancer. 2 weeks later, Paul Castellano was murdered, an event many believe would never have occurred if Dellacroce had still been alive. His death marked the end of the old mafia and the beginning of its ultimate decline.